Hampton Plantation. I'm Ranger Hannah. I'm the interpreter here at Hampton Plantation State Historic Site. We are in McClellanville, South Carolina, and if you haven't heard of McClellanville, it's a tiny place. We're about halfway between Myrtle Beach and Charleston on the coast, about an hour out from each. There are 3 different plantation sites within the State Park Service, Hampton, Red Cliff, and Rose Hill. And between all 3 of our sites, we do talk about a range of history. So not just the plantation in colonial times or antebellum times, but going through the Civil War, into Reconstruction, and even beyond. What happened at the plantations after slavery was over? What happens going into the new century, and how does that connect to us today? So one thing that we do talk about around this time of year, there is an important date, June 19th, which you may have heard of. But before we get into that, I do want to set some context a little bit for Hampton specifically. So at the height of the plantation here, there were about 300 people enslaved. We do have records of people who attempted to free themselves by escaping, by running away. The reason we have record of that is newspaper advertisements that were placed after they escaped from the plantation owner saying, this person is on the run, be on the lookout for them, they need to be returned here. We don't have any newspaper advertisements or written family records that say what happened to some of these people. So specifically, Joe or Sogo are some of the names that we know for people who attempted to find their own freedom from Hampton. We don't know if they were recaptured or not, but we do know there were people who tried to free themselves. But then we get into the Civil War, and one of the big things that happened is the Emancipation Proclamation. Now this one you've definitely heard of. This is an announcement from Abraham Lincoln saying slavery is abolished. What does that do in practice? Not a lot at first. One of the things about the Emancipation Proclamation was that it freed those who were still enslaved in Confederate-controlled areas. The Confederacy doesn't recognize that it's part of the United States. They don't recognize that Abraham Lincoln has any authority as the president. So obviously they don't free anybody because of this proclamation. This is more of a symbolic gesture at this point from Lincoln saying the United States is committed to abolishing slavery. There were some areas that were already under Union control in the South that do acknowledge this Emancipation Proclamation. For South Carolina specifically, along the coast, places like Hilton Head and Beaufort were already under Union control, and emancipation comes there a little bit earlier than in other places in the South. So that is a big one. The other big one is the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment, when that goes into effect, that's a little bit after the end of the Civil War, and that one abolishes slavery in the United States, except for anyone who has been imprisoned, convicted of a crime, but other than that, involuntary servitude and slavery has been made illegal. So those are some big dates. We don't know for sure how any of this news reached Hampton. We have records from other plantations where you hear or can read about people who are enslaved there who get the news from someone on horseback who comes riding through, from the plantation owner who says, well, the war is over, you're free. There's no record of anything like that at Hampton, so we don't know, especially considering how isolated we are, how the people who were enslaved here first heard that they were free, or even the results of the end of the Civil War. But there is one other place where there is a big freedom announcement, and this comes in between the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, and it comes on June 19th. And that is the other date that we're going to talk about. So where does that June 19th date come in? So again, to set some context here, in areas like Louisiana and Mississippi, where there were large plantations and Union troops were coming in from the Gulf of Mexico, many slaveholders, these plantation owners, moved away from where the Union was coming in and went out to the frontier, which at that point was Texas. So consider, at this point, Texas has been a state for maybe 20 years. There's no other states west of that yet. So this is still kind of the frontier, and it's still fairly isolated. But there are estimates that maybe 150,000 enslaved people were moved from Louisiana and Mississippi into Texas to get away from Union troops. But the Union does get to Texas. So in June of 1865, Major General Gordon Granger comes into the port at Galveston, Texas. And it's after Lincoln's been assassinated even. So this is a very, very end of the war. But it's still isolated. It's the frontier. So Major General Gordon Granger gives this announcement, General Order Number 3, and I can actually read it out for you. The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. It does also go on to say the freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. So there is pushback from the local ex-Confederates in Texas, but this is essentially freedom coming to Texas, and there is a big celebration. And this is June 19th, 1865, so this is where that date comes in. Even by the next year, in 1866, the people in Texas are celebrating this new holiday, which is Juneteenth, which is celebrating the coming of emancipation. And at first, it's pretty much a regional holiday, so it's really only a Texan thing. But then we do get into the advent of these Jim Crow laws. So there's a brief period of Reconstruction where these celebrations are big, but then there's more laws being passed that restrict these new freedoms. So with the Jim Crow laws coming in, the popularity of the celebration does die down a little bit, up until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, which brings it back not just in Texas, but across the nation. So you can find Juneteenth celebrations everywhere now. This is still a little bit of a regional thing, depending on where you are. For example, in Charleston, emancipation is celebrated every year on January 1st, which is also the new year, because that's when it happened for Charleston. But in areas like Beaufort County, where emancipation came pretty early, they have a very large Juneteenth celebration, several within the county. And that's how that date in 1865 becomes a major holiday. So with that explanation, Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth, and the 13th Amendment, this is how emancipation comes to these plantation sites. But there's more that happens after that. For example, one thing that we have is in the 1930s, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, interviews a lot of people in the South, specifically those who were formerly enslaved or related to those who were formerly enslaved. And one of the interviews that we have from someone who was local is with Gabriel Myers. And he talks about in that interview being able to send his children to school, how they learned to read and write and do math, which is something that previous to the war would have been illegal. He talks about there's a dance hall down the street. He talks about going hunting with the community, going to church, about the house that he's been able to build. So there's some things that have changed with emancipation, but again, those Jim Crow laws do come in. So there are some things that stay the same, and that's a little bit more than we have time to go into for this video. But my sister's sites, Redcliffe and Rose Hill, will also be doing some videos focusing around Juneteenth and the history there. So you can check those out as well. But for right now, thank you for watching, and happy Juneteenth.